and welcome back to Just Before Bed, our chapter book reading. We're going to continue reading Tilly's Moonlit Garden, and this is night number 4, and we're going to get right into the book. Chapter 16. Tilly woke up late to a different sound, music. Granny was singing along to the radio. By the time she'd got dressed and gone downstairs, Granny had already flung open all the windows to let in the fresh air. Light flooded the house, but it was so cold. "You'll need at least 2 extra thick sweaters on today, Tilly," Granny said, "inside and out." The house already seemed different with Granny sorting things out. The washing machine was whirring in the kitchen, and sheets and blankets covers were hung out on a line across the lawn. Tilly looked at the clock. It was 9:30 already. She'd forgotten all about school, and so had Granny. Neither of them mentioned it. It was as if they both agreed that there was something more important to be done today. The horrible feeling in her stomach she got when it was a school day began to ebb away. "Your dad's already gone back to the hospital. He sent his love. Your mom's doing fine. We'll go and see her later," Granny said. After breakfast, Granny put on her coat. "Right. Now you can show me the garden." Tilly took the crust from her toast with them. She showed Granny how the birds flew down from the trees to be fed. The robin perched on the bench again. Granny followed behind while Tilly took the route down the path next to the raspberry bushes, down to the apple trees, and along past the prickly bushes. "Gooseberries," Granny said. To the clump of funny, knobby pink stumps, rhubarb, and the hedge that leaves on it, and a hedge with leaves on it, beech. Granny kept stopping to look closer at dried-up bits of plants. "Look, Tilly!" Granny was smoothing away dead leaves to show her something hidden underneath. Tilly saw tiny pink flowers with petals like folded back ears and gray-green heart-shaped leaves. "They're called cyclamen," Granny said. Granny showed her a tiny pale green tips of snowdrops already poking up through the earth, ready for spring. "It looks like everything's dead in the winter garden, but it's all just there, waiting under the earth, already alive and growing." They found a twiggy tree with pink, sweet-scented flowers growing out of the tips of a bare branch. Granny broke off some twigs to take inside. "Viburnum, they'll look nice on the kitchen table." She picked some ivy to go with it. They had reached the 2 bushes on either side of the gate. Granny stopped and looked through the gate to the grassy path. "Where does that go?" she asked Tilly. "I don't know." "We should go and explore later." "There's a fox," Tilly said quietly. "It comes into the garden at night." Granny looked at Tilly. "How exciting," she said. "Perhaps it comes along that path. Now I need to put in the next load of washing. Do you want to come back with me or stay and play in the garden?" "Back with you." Granny made hot berry drink for Tilly and herself. "I phoned the school earlier," she said to Tilly. "I said you're still a little under the weather." "Am I?" "Not exactly, but I know it's hard for you, Tilly, with your mom being ill." Tilly didn't want to talk about it, but it was a huge relief that she didn't have to go to school. "We'll bring her some flowers later," Granny said. "Why don't you go and pick some more of the viburnum sprigs? She'll love that. They'll smell sweet as anything." Tilly took the kitchen scissors from the silverware drawer and went out into the garden again. She'd pick a huge bunch of the flowering twigs, the ones where the flowers were fully opened and smelled the sweetest. Tilly stepped back inside the kitchen and laid the bunch of twigs on the table. Granny was talking to someone out in the hallway. Tilly listened. She couldn't help it. "It's a real sign of anxiety, sleepwalking," Granny was saying. "I know it's understandable, but anything could have happened." "Yes, I know." Who was sleepwalking? Was she talking about Mom? Tilly wondered. Granny came back into the kitchen. She smiled at Tilly and pointed to the phone she was holding. "We'll see you in about an hour, then," Granny said into the phone. "Lovely. Bye for now." Granny turned to Tilly. "Your dad, everything's fine. I told him we'll be at the hospital right after lunch." You think Granny thinks that Tilly's sleepwalking? Tilly didn't like the look of the hospital. She didn't like the smell either. She was glad she'd brought the flowers from the garden for Mom. They found her in a room by herself, not with the other woman in the ward. A big window had a view of the hills and the tops of the trees, and down over the parking lot if you stood close and looked down. "They smell gorgeous," Mom said when Tilly brought the flowers up close. "And how are you, Lambkin?" "I'm not a lambkin," Tilly said crossly. Dad went to get coffee. Tilly tried out the headphones for the TV and the radio. Next, she fidgeted with the things on Mom's nightstand, and then there wasn't anything to do. Granny and Mom were whispering softly together. She picked up the chart on the end of Mom's bed, which had lines and red crosses and scribbles in messy writing. She wished little Fox were here. She went off to explore by herself anyway. No one took much notice of her. She walked past a ward full of women all laughing and joking, and one of them waved at her. Then she went through some swinging doors and along a corridor, through another door labeled Special Neonatal Unit. Through a long glass window on one side of the corridor, she saw a small room full of plastic cribs and loads of tubes and wires and things, and the tiniest real babies she had ever seen, with funny knitted bonnets and mittens. They were laying on sheepskin. They all had tubes taped in their noses. Tilly couldn't stop herself from staring until a nurse suddenly saw her and whisked a curtain back across the window. That squirmy eel feeling was in her stomach suddenly. She was hot all over. She started running back to find Mom, scared she might have forgotten the way, but whew, there it was, the swinging door with its blue sign, Prenatal Ward. She leaned against the heavy door, her heart thumping too hard in her chest. She closed her eyes. She could feel it. Thump, 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 thump. The blood rushing in her ears. Those tiny babies all covered in wires and tubes, lying all alone in the plastic cribs. It had looked all wrong and terrible. Tilly went more slowly along the corridor and pushed open the door to Mom's room. Granny and Dad were sipping coffee from plastic cups, and Mom was smiling. Tilly let out a long breath. She sat on the bottom of Mom's bed and watched a pigeon preening its feathers on the windowsill while the grown-ups talked. "So what did the doctor say?" Granny asked Mom. "How long does she think it will be?" "Soon now. If not, they'll do a cesarean." "Have you got everything ready? Do you need me to buy you anything?" "We've got most of the stuff already from when we had Tilly," Dad said. The pigeon tapped the window with its beak. It bent its head and looked at Tilly with its beady eyes. Tilly stood up. The pigeon flew off. She watched it fly out into the parking lot and started pecking at half a sandwich laying in the gutter. She thought about the hungry fox and about the girl living in the old house, the girl called Helen. "Can we go now?" Tilly asked Grandma. "Whenever you like," Granny said. "Thanks for coming," Mom said. "It was wonderful to see you, Tilly. Your pretty twigs have filled the whole room with their sweet scent." Tilly leaned over to kiss Mom goodbye. She walked away as quickly as she could before the tears came. Granny drove fast. When they stopped at a red traffic light, she reached across for Tilly's hand. Tilly pulled her hand away. "Has Dad explained Mom's illness to you, Tilly? I mean properly, so you understand?" Tilly bit down on her lip. She didn't answer. "As soon as the baby comes, Mom will be better," Granny said. "For now, because of her headaches and high blood pressure, she has to lie down and rest and be extra careful." Tilly watched a cyclist go past the car to the front of the traffic line. He had a little seat on the back for a child. She tried to block out Granny's voice. She didn't want to think about the words. Granny was saying something about your baby brother or sister. A picture came into Tilly's head of those tiny babies in the incubator, struggling to breathe and eat, born too soon. And then the lights went green and they were off again, and Granny was quiet, concentrating on driving them home. Granny cooked sausages and baked potatoes for supper, but Tilly wasn't hungry. "Can I go out to play in the garden?" she asked. "It's dark, Tilly, and too cold. Wait until the morning." Tilly knew the fox would be hungry. When the telephone rang and Granny went to answer it, she picked up her leftover lunch and wrapped it in kitchen paper. She slipped out the back door and ran fast across the damp grass to the garden gate. "Fox," she called. She waited, but no fox appeared. Anxious now, she pushed the potato and sausage through the gate onto the grass path and ran back to the kitchen before Granny realized she'd gone out. It was bedtime. Dad was still at the hospital. "I don't need you to read me a story," Tilly told Granny. "I'm too sleepy tonight." Well, Granny said, in that case, I'll run myself a bath and have an early night, too. It's been a busy day. I hope you sleep better. What was Granny talking about? Tilly tried hard to stay awake. She listened to Granny pottering about, having her bath and sorting her things out in the spare room at the end of the landing. She watched the shadows dance around the room from the lamp by her bed. She propped herself up on the pillows so she could see the dollhouse better. Was Helen in bed yet? Or still up, climbing trees or running around the garden? Perhaps she was sitting in the den or playing with the fox she'd somehow tamed. Tilly climbed out of the bed again and drew back the curtains to look out. All she could see was her own reflection. She turned off the bedside light and looked again, her face pressed against the cold glass. The dark shapes of trees and bushes were swaying in the wind. The clouds moved fast across the moon. The first spatter of rain hit the window. Tilly climbed back into bed. She listened to the rain and the wind battering the house. The fox would be safe and dry in its den deep in the bramble thicket. She hoped it had found the food she left earlier. She still hadn't heard Dad come home from the hospital. The knot of worry inside her was getting bigger, taking up all the space. So do you think that Tilly is dreaming and sleepwalking, or do you think that she's really seeing the fox and Helen? Interesting to think. Chapter 17. Well, you did sleep well, Granny whisked back the curtain in Tilly's room, right through that storm and everything. Daylight flooded the room. As Tilly woke up, the pain in her stomach came back too. Is Dad here? She said. He stayed the night with Mom at the hospital, Granny said in her extra cheerful voice. I expect he thought it would be lonely for your mom all by herself. Tilly reached out a hand for the little clock on her bedside table. 20 to 10, she said. Yes, it's much too late for you to go to school now, so we'll have another nice day doing things together. Won't school be upset? No, I've explained everything to your teacher. If you feel up to it, you can write some more of your stories, she says. Tilly didn't ask what exactly Granny had explained. The relief at not having to go to school flooded over her. Granny was still talking. So get washed and dressed, and then you can go and see if the storm did any damage in the garden, and we have to feed those birds. Tilly tried to eat a bowl of porridge since Granny had made it specially with brown sugar melting on the top. She managed 2 spoonfuls, then she put on her coat and boots and ran outside before Granny could say anything. The birds were waiting for her in the tree. They flew down for toast crumbs, no longer scared of her, and a robin chirped from the bench and followed her as she went through the gate across into the wild garden. The food she'd left out for the fox was gone. A large branch had fallen in the storm. Tilly had to climb over it. The bark was wet and slippery and stained her hands green. Everything was sopping wet. The long grass had been flattened, and the old rose had fallen off the wall. Tilly went farther across the wild garden. She gasped. Her den was partially collapsed. The branches had fallen down. The woven grass was just a soggy mess. She stared at it, and then she set to work, tugging the branches back into position, mending it as best she could. She wished Helen would come and help her. She looked around in case she was watching, hidden in a tree or playing in another part of the garden, but the garden just seemed empty. There was no one here, no sound of singing or rustling of leaves. Even the birds seemed quiet. Drips rained down from the trees overhead every time the wind blew the wet branches. Have you ever been outside when the trees have water on the leaves and the wind blows and it's like raining on you again? Tilly started putting back the spiral of pebbles, arranging the scattered stones in size order. Her hands were freezing cold and the pebbles felt clammy and horrid. She put the long table back upright in the middle of the den, and then she saw something else half hidden under a pile of dead branches. The corner of an old square tin box. She pulled it out and pried open the lid. Inside she found a stump of a candle and a book. Tilly took out the book very carefully. It was old, like the ones in Dad's study, with a green cover and thick cream pages and pictures. Black and white line drawings on almost every page, and just a few in color on a page by themselves, with a sheet of very thin, almost transparent paper over the top, which you had to lift up so you could see the pictures. Carefully, she turned the pages. The edges of the pages were mottled with brown spots, as if the book had gotten wet. Helen must have left it here before the storm in the night. Tilly imagined her reading the book by the light of the candle, snug in Tilly's den. Tilly half expected to hear her at any moment, singing that tune that seemed to get right into her head, but there was only that drip, drip of water running off the leaves and branches in the trees and shrubs around her, and the call of some bird repeating the same two notes over and over. There was no sign of the fox. Tilly could see where the grass and brambles had been squashed down as it made its way to the den each day. In the soft mud at the edge, she thought she could make out paw prints. The fox was probably curled up asleep, warm and dry in the den it had hollowed out in the earth. Well, she could try to find the house. She could try to find the house herself. Helen might be there, even though it was morning and a school day. Tilly pushed her way through the thicket of trees, stumbled over broke fallen branches and twigs and long trailing creeper vines that dangled from the tops of trees like ropes for monkey swings. She went past huge ferns like tongues. In the dark, she hadn't seen any of this. It was even harder work than before, clambering through the tangled woods. There wasn't a path, just a whole maze of animal tracks, and it was impossible to remember which way the fox had taken her before. Any minute now, Tilly thought, and I'll get to the other side and the lawn with the statues and the pond and the house. She tried for a long time pushing through the undergrowth, getting scratched and wet, and still she couldn't find the way. She seemed to have been gone for hours. Finally, she gave up and went back home. She was nearly there. That bird was calling, repeating its cry, and then another sound echoed, like a bird but not quite right. Tilly suddenly thought, a person imitating a bird. Was Helen up there, up in the tree, teasing her? But she couldn't start searching for her now. Granny was standing at the open garden gate, looking up and down the green path. She whirled around as she caught sight of Tilly. Where have you been? I was really worried. Didn't you hear me calling you? Tilly put her arms around Granny. Sorry, she whispered. You're soaking wet. What have you been doing? Exploring, Tilly whispered. Mending my den. You must tell me when you go off, Tilly. I'm looking after you, remember? You can't just go wandering into some old wasteland to play. It isn't safe. It's a garden, not a wasteland, Tilly said indignantly. And it's totally safe. And then, before she thought about it, what she was saying, it belongs to my friend. Granny looked at her. And which friend is that? She's called Helen. Granny said, as if she didn't believe a word of it. Back in the warm kitchen, Granny wanted to hear more about Tilly's friend. What did you say her name was? Helen. Granny's eyes went narrow. Does she go to your school? Tilly shook her head. I've only seen her twice, she said. She lives in the house on the other side of the trees. The garden's huge. Well, that's nice. Should we invite her over to play here? Tilly didn't know what to say, but Granny was persistent. I've only been there through the woods in the magic garden, Tilly said, but there might be another way. Granny was quiet for a bit. Is she a real friend or a made-up one? She finally asked. Tilly wouldn't answer any more questions after that. Granny made coffee for herself. Tilly frothed up the milk for her with Dad's electric whisk. There must be another way around to the house, Granny said. We'll go later, you and me. We'll go for a walk and call on Helen and invite her to tea. Granny put on her coat and boots. Tilly got ready too, but slowly. She didn't want Granny interfering with her and Helen. She thought quickly what to do. Perhaps if she distracted Granny, she'd forget about finding where Helen lives. Let's explore where the grassy path goes, Granny, she said. I've never been up there. Tilly led the way out of the garden gate and then turned right along the path. It ran between the two gardens so that the tumbled-down stone wall of the magic garden was on one side and the beech hedge of Tilly's garden was on the other. No wonder there are foxes, Granny said, following Tilly along the pathway. Isn't it lovely? Like living in the countryside. You wouldn't expect it so close to the city. The path got muddier. There were ruts and puddles. They reached the end of both gardens. Now there was an overgrown hedge on both sides, then woodland, and finally they came to a big wooden farm gate. Farmland, Granny said, but there's a stile. Look, so the path goes on across the field. Tilly climbed over the stile and then she stopped. 3 horses in the field had stopped grazing and turned their heads to watch. They began to trot towards the gate. Tilly climbed quickly back over the stile. So the stile must be some sort of a fence or a gate type of fence. They only want to say hello, Granny said, but the horses looked huge close up. They rolled their eyes. When Granny reached up her hand to stroke their noses, they stamped their feet and reared their heads, showing their teeth. Perhaps we won't go into their field after all, Granny said. It started to spit rain. Can we go back now? Tilly said. Don't you want to find Helen's house? Granny asked. Let's just quickly explore the other way. It would be good to have someone to play with, wouldn't it? It was a boring walk, back the way they came, and then on and on. The grass track became a stony lane, and finally it joined the road. If we turn right here, Granny said, and go along the road for a bit, that should bring us up to the front anyway, into Helen's house, logically speaking. So she thinks she's going to take the road instead of going through the garden to find Helen's house. She smiled at Tilly. We can ask her mom if she minds you going into the wild bit of garden by yourself. I'd rather be sure. Tilly dragged her feet. This wasn't right. Through the trees, she glimpsed the shape of a house set back from the road, but it looked very different now, in the daylight. Nothing like the house she'd seen before. Granny stopped. She was reading something, a sign nailed to a post next to the wall. Land for sale, by auction. Granny read out the words loud enough for Tilly to hear. They must be selling that huge wild garden, she said, and no wonder. It's much too big for one family to look after. Granny waited for her to catch up. I want to go back, Tilly said. I don't like it here. It's all wrong. Everything's wrong. Suddenly, everything felt all muddled and horrible. She didn't want Granny there. She wanted Mom. Granny came after her. Wait, she called, but Tilly started to run. Tilly couldn't answer Granny's questions. The real answers didn't make any sense. She didn't want to tell Granny anything, not about hearing Helen in the garden and finding the things she left, or about the fox taking her to the other part of the garden, and how she'd seen Helen up a tree before she went into her house with the rose-patterned wallpaper and the tiled floor, or about Christmas Eve and their midnight feast. Tilly wished she'd never mentioned Helen in the first place. She wished she could turn back time. Granny filled up the kettle and switched it on. She put the teapot next to the sink and a mug on the kitchen table, ready for tea. Tilly went upstairs to her bedroom and shut the door. She knelt down in front of the dollhouse with its tiled roof and chimney on either side. That kind of sounds like the Helen's house. And its green painted wooden bay windows and cream walls. She opened the hinged front. She got everything out of all the rooms, the people and the furniture, and even the tiny pictures hanging on the tiny nails on the rose-patterned walls. She put it all in a pile, and then she found an old shoebox and dumped everything in there and shoved it to the back of her wardrobe. She pushed the dollhouse under the bed so she didn't have to see it anymore. She lay on the bed and cried. Dad was home at last. Tilly ran down the stairs to open the front door for him. She hugged him tight. Dad looked surprised. Hey, Tilly, that's a nice welcome. He hugged her back. Mom sends her hugs and kisses, Dad said. They went into the kitchen to make tea for Dad. They went past the living room door. Granny was sitting on the sofa knitting something with fine white wool. The needles clickety-clicked. Tilly looked away quickly. Tomorrow, I want to go to school, Tilly told Dad. I've decided. Good plan, Dad said. He looked pleased. Written any more of your story? Tilly shook her head. Me neither. How about we both work on our stories till supper time? While Dad tap-tapped on the laptop in his study, Tilly lay on the carpet and drew with her new pastels and watercolor paints onto thick white paper. My story has changed, she told Dad. It's not about a cat anymore. It's about a fox and a girl and a magical garden. Excellent, Dad said. The best stories change a lot while you're writing them. Can I read it when it's ready? Tilly nodded. How long do you think? Hours or days? Dad asked. A day at least, Tilly said. How about yours? You wouldn't want to read mine, Dad laughed. And mine won't be ready for a long time. Hours or days? Tilly asked. Months. A year even. What's yours about? Dad looked puzzled. Well, It's about a boy growing up and about a family, I suppose. Sounds boring, Tilly said, which made Dad laugh. It's nice, both of us working like this, Tilly thought, as she painted the fox's tail russet brown. The clock ticked. The faint sound of music on the radio drifted up the stairs. Outside, it was raining hard. I'm going back to see Mom after supper, Dad told Tilly. We think the baby might be born tonight. Chapter 18. Dad read Tilly the next chapter of her book. She looked up when he finished. You didn't really need me to read you this, he said. I know you could read it by yourself, but I'm glad you let me read to you still. He kissed her goodnight. He stroked her hair. Dad didn't seem to want to go. Won't Mom be needing you? Tilly asked eventually. Dad kissed her again. Yes. Are you going to be all right? Tilly nodded. See you tomorrow, then. Tilly's throat was tight. Night-night. Give Mom a hug from me. She listened to Dad's feet going along the landing and down the stairs, and then the sound of the door opening and closing, and the car engine. She imagined him arriving at the hospital. All the windows would be lit up, shining out into the dark. He would go up to the stairs, 2 at a time, and walk fast along the maze of corridors and through the swinging doors to Mom's ward, where Mom would be waiting for him. Tilly didn't want to imagine what would happen after that. She knew a bit about babies being born. She knew it sometimes hurt a lot, and she didn't want to think about those 2 tiny babies who might not survive because they've been born too soon. This baby wasn't supposed to be born until February. Granny tapped on the door and called out, Good night, Tilly. Sweet dreams. Night-night, Granny, Tilly called back. But of course she wouldn't have sweet dreams. How could she when she wouldn't be going to sleep? She let herself begin to doze a bit so she would have more energy for later. She hoped Granny would go to bed early again so she wouldn't have to wait so long. The phone rang. Tilly got out of bed and opened her door a little so she could listen to what Granny was saying, but it didn't seem to be anything important. She shut the door again and hopped back into bed. She snuggled down under the blanket. She still had her socks on and a sweater, and under her pajamas Dad hadn't noticed. The window rattled as the gust of wind buffeted it, and she heard rain pattering onto the path outside. Inside, she was cozy, warm as toast, getting very sleepy. The fox barked 3 times. Chapter 19. The fox was standing at the gate. Its eyes glowed amber, watching Tilly's every movement. When Tilly held out her gifts of bacon and lime and coconut cake, the fox crept forward, its belly low, and took the food delicately from Tilly's hand without biting or hurting her. The fox gulped it down without chewing, and then turned and padded towards the magic garden. Tilly watched the white tip of its tail flicker in the darkness. Tilly picked her way through the wet grass and climbed over the fallen tree, trying not to get the slimy green stuff on her hands. Ahead, something moved, a hand, pale, waving at her from inside the den. I've been here ages, Helen said quietly. I'd hoped you'd come, and then it started raining, so I wasn't sure, but I've mended the roof. Look, with some old tarpaulin I found. It's quite dry inside. She shifted over to make room for Tilly. It's amazing, Tilly said. It's as good as new. Thank you. Shh, Helen said. Keep your voice down. We don't want to scare her off. Scare who? The vixen. She's getting ready to have cubs. I'm sure of it now. She might even have had them. I thought I heard tiny squeaking sounds, and I stayed really quiet and still, and then the vixen came running from the trees. She shot into the brambles. It's a she-fox, so a vixen is a female fox. Tilly said, I never thought of that. Helen laughed. She's a vixen, and this will be her first litter, and that's why she's hungry all the time. She can't find enough food for herself. It all goes on growing the babies inside her. That's what I think, anyway. Is she your pet fox? Tilly asked. No, you can't keep a fox as a pet. A fox is a wild animal, Helen laughed again, but I feed her every day if I can. I fed her too, Tilly said. I know. Tilly's face flushed. I waited for you that time, and I've looked and looked for you since then, but you never came, and I realized I've never seen you in the daytime. It's always the night. She looked at Helen, her smooth, pale skin, her oval face framed by her red-brown hair. but I found the book and the candle in the tin, so I knew you must have been back. Did you like the book? Tilly nodded. You can keep it if you like. Helen stopped talking abruptly to listen. Tilly listened too. Do you think we'll see the babies? She whispered. Not yet, it's too soon. And you'll have to be very careful and quiet. The fox will be extra nervous. It's very early in the spring for cubs. She'll have a hard time hunting for food. I gave her some cake earlier, Tilly said. Helen sniffed. She needs proper food. Like what? Mice and baby rabbits and small birds and frogs, worms even. Tilly shivered. What's that? She peered out into the dark. Something was rustling in the undergrowth. They both leaned forward, listening. The trouble is, Helen whispered, if the vixen gets disturbed, she might abandon her babies. You mustn't go too close. Promise not to tell anyone they're here. Grown-ups get funny about foxes. They don't like them. Oh, Tilly had a sudden horrible thought. She remembered the words Granny had read aloud from the sign. What if someone buys the garden? Tilly said, and then they start cutting down the trees and the brambles and everything. What will happen to the fox cubs then? Helen looked as if she'd been stung. For a moment she sat completely still. What do you mean, buy the garden? She said. Her voice was cold and hard and quiet. The garden belongs to us, the birds and the foxes and all the wild creatures. There was a sign up, Tilly said, about land for sale and an auction or something. There was a date, too. Helen stared at her eyes dark in their pale face. Tilly shivered. She felt sick. Something was terribly wrong. Helen started scrambling her way towards the entrance, bundling the candles and book and everything into the blanket in a terrible rush. Where are you going? Tilly said. Don't go, Helen. What's the matter? What did I say? I'm sorry. Wait. She tried to follow Helen out through the narrow door, but it was too late. By the time she crawled out of the den and stood up, Helen was gone. It was raining again, icy rain, turning to sleet. Tilly pulled the tarpaulin over the entrance to the den to keep it dry inside. She picked her way across the sodden grass back towards her own house. The sleet had turned to snow, soft, wet flakes of it clinging to her pajamas and her hair. Her feet were soaking wet. If there's snow, there will be footprints, Tilly thought, and paw prints, and then someone will find out about the fox. And I've upset Helen, and now she won't be friends with me, and I'll probably never see her again. She began to cry, and now she'd started, she couldn't stop. Tears ran down her face, mixing with the wet snow, and everything was blurry, so she could hardly see the way. Tilly! Tilly! Granny was saying her name and holding her arm gently, talking softly. This way, Tilly, love. Everything's fine. Just along here. Back you go. No need to wake up. She was steering her along the mossy corridor into the bedroom, towards the white bed, like snow. Granny was rubbing her wet hair with a towel and pulling off her wet socks. Tilly heard her own voice whispering back, saying something muddled about babies and footprints and Helen. But she was so sleepy, drifting off, sinking back under the warm blanket, and Granny was tucking her in, smoothing her hair, soothing her back to sleep. I wonder if she's sleepwalking. You think she's sleepwalking? We'll find out. Chapter 20. Tilly knew she was dreaming this time, even though she was in the dream too. She was outside at the gate. The fox led the way, like the last time, through the wet grass and under the trees, past the fallen rose and the newly repaired den, the bramble patch, into the woods. Tilly looked for things to remember the way, landmarks she could find in the daylight by herself. But it was hard, in the dark, to see anything very much, and it was all the same, trees and prickly bushes and dead leaves and fallen branches, ghostly ropes of old creepers that swayed and rustled. It smelled of damp and decay and rot, musty old smells like forgotten cupboards and blocked drains. The dark got less black as they came out of the trees onto grass, but where before there had been a huge round lawn with stone statues and a pond, and the house with its open front door, light spilling out onto the gravel path, now it was all empty and dark. The lawn was a tangle of overgrown grass and bushes. No one had cut it for years. The blank windows of the empty house looked like hollow eyes. She knew there was no point going forward. The house was deserted, and the girl, Helen, was long gone. "Take me home," Tilly whispered, but the fox had disappeared. Tilly was alone in the dark, and she had no idea how to find her way back. Granny was there again, sitting on the bed. "It's all right, Tilly," she said. "You're safe in bed, and everything's fine." Tilly blinked. The light was glowing on the bedside table, making shadows across the room. "You've been dreaming again," Granny said. "That's all." Tilly looked at the clock. 5 o'clock, she said. "That's nearly morning." "Yes, but it won't be light for another 2 hours, Tilly, so go back to sleep. Yes, please try." Tilly nodded. "Should I leave the light on?" "Yes." When Granny had gone back to her own room again, Tilly got out of bed to look out the window. It was snowing properly now, huge feathery flakes filling the sky, whirling down. Tilly watched it for ages. Little by little, the horrible empty feeling from the dream drained away. Little by little, she sat at the window. A new feeling came, a sort of fizzing, tingling feeling that started at the tip of her toes and went right through her to the top of her head. The feeling that comes when something exciting is about to happen. Tilly watched the falling snow until her feet were too cold to bear, and then she crept back into bed and snuggled under the covers. Outside, the garden filled softly with snow. Chapter 21. The telephone was ringing. It seemed to fill the whole house with its urgent sound. Tilly sat bolt upright. The bedroom was full of light. She'd been asleep, and it was properly morning now. The ringing went on and on. Tilly shot out of bed and ran downstairs to pick up the phone. "Tilly," Dad's voice. He sounded breathless, excited. "Guess what?" Tilly could hardly breathe. "The baby?" "Yes, a little boy, and he's fine, and Mom's fine." Dad sounded as if he was crying. Tilly's insides turned somersaults. Granny was padding downstairs. She stopped at the bottom step and waited, her face full of questions. Dad was still talking. "He's very small, but completely perfect. He's breathing by himself and even feeding. And oh, you have to come and see him as soon as Granny can bring you, Tilly. Is she there? Can I speak to her?" Tilly passed the phone to Granny. She went into the kitchen, opened the back door, and a blast of cold air rushed in. The snow had settled on the path and the grass. Not a single blade of grass showed now. She shoved her feet into her boots and ran out, leaving huge prints over the white garden. Even the tree was covered. Little avalanches of snow slid off the overloaded twigs, making shushing sounds. The snow creaked under the weight of her boots as she ran and danced and spun. It had snowed, and her baby brother had just been born, the very same night, and now Mom would get better. Everything was going to be all right. Tilly started picking up handfuls of snow, packing it with her bare hands, rolling it into a ball. "I'll make a snow fox instead of a snowman, an Arctic fox." She remembered the book in Miss Almond's classroom. She swallowed hard. But she'd decided, hadn't she? She told Dad she would go back to school today, and she would. There wasn't anything to be frightened of. "Tilly," Grandma called from the back doorstep, "come and get dressed. You'll freeze to death dressed like that." Tilly ran back to the kitchen. Granny gave her a huge hug. "Isn't it the best news? Amazing and wonderful. A baby brother, Tilly." She held Tilly tight, and Tilly squeezed her back. "We'll go and see them later," Granny said. "Am I still going to school?" Tilly asked. "What do you think? What would you like to do?" Tilly took a deep breath. "School," she said, "and go and see Mom after." "Let's get breakfast then," Granny said. Granny wanted to come into the classroom, but Tilly said no. "It's not allowed," Tilly said. "I don't see why not," Granny huffed. "Only the preschool classes allow moms and dads in," Tilly explained. "I'll be fine. Don't worry, Granny." Granny was giving her that look again, as if she didn't quite believe her. "I'll be back at 3:30, and we'll drive straight to the hospital," Granny said. She kissed Tilly goodbye on the top of her head. Tilly stamped her snowy boots on the mat and went down the corridor to her classroom. She hung up her wet coat and went straight in. She was early. Mrs. Almond was sitting at the table at the front, writing notes. She looked up. "Tilly, how lovely to see you. Welcome back." Tilly smiled shyly. "How's your mom?" Mrs. Almond asked. "She's in the hospital. The baby was born last night." "Oh, Tilly, how exciting." I haven't seen them yet, Tilly said. I'm going after school today. It's a boy. Has he got a name yet? Tilly shook her head. She went to her drawer and to take out her school reading book. It seemed a long time since she'd looked at it. Do you want to choose something else? Mrs. Almond said. Have you looked through the new books I've put out on the shelf? New books smelled wonderful, Tilly thought. She liked being the first person to open the pages. She chose one with a lovely color about an elephant. She read the first page about a girl called Christy. That was Mom's name. The story made it sound as if the girl was exploring in the jungle, but really she was playing. It was the sort of game Tilly liked, where you made up stuff. The classroom was beginning to fill up. Lucy said hello to Tilly shyly when Harriet was busy talking to Simone. A girl she didn't recognize with lovely brown hair and eyes came through the classroom door and hovered there, unsure. Mrs. Almond went over to the girl. She brought her over to Tilly's table. Susila only started on Monday. Perhaps you would help her today. Tilly nodded. Susila kept her eyes down, looking at the table, not at Tilly. So Tilly had to do the talking to begin with. I've been away for a few days, she explained. My mom's just had a baby, and I'm going to see them this afternoon. We moved here in the middle of last term, so I've only been at the school since then. Susila didn't speak. Tilly tried again. Have you just moved here too? Susila nodded. From London. I've been to London, Tilly said, on the train, to the Natural History Museum and the Science Museum and the London Eye. Which was your favorite? Susila asked. I like the Natural History Museum, Tilly said, because of the whale and the dinosaur, but I didn't like the stuffed animals and the birds. Susila pulled her reading book out of her bag and put it on the table. Tilly glimpsed the title, The Midnight Fox. Her heart beat a little faster. She thought about her own fox with tiny cubs in the snow. Mrs. Almond started to call the names for attendance. At recess, Susila followed Tilly outside. Harriet, Lucy, and Simone were already sitting on the bench looking bored and cold. Lots of other children were racing around and throwing snowballs when the teachers weren't looking. A big group of fifth graders started making an igloo. We could make a snow animal, Tilly said. I was going to make a snow fox in our garden at home, but I ran out of time. We could make lots of little snowbirds. That would be quicker, Susila said. Two younger girls wanted to help. Other children came to watch. Soon there was a row of small doves on the playground, and then the bell rang and it was time to line up and go back inside. Tilly's hands were bright red, freezing cold, but it was the first time she'd actually enjoyed recess in a long time. And after that, Tilly was just excited about going to see Mom and the baby, and it was hard to concentrate on anything else at school at all. Granny was waiting for her at the gate at 3:30. How was it? Granny asked. Good, Tilly said. We made snowbirds, but they've all melted now. I went shopping, Granny said as she started the car. I thought you might want to give a little present to the baby, and then I couldn't resist one for you. It's in that bag if you want to look. Tilly opened the bag. Two soft animals were in there, a white polar bear and a small fox with red-brown fur and a white-tipped tail. Granny glanced at her. The fox is for you, to replace the one you lost. Tilly took it out of the bag. It was quite sweet, soft, furry, all clean and new, but it was nothing like Little Fox. And anyway, you couldn't just replace one animal with another. Granny should know that. It's nice, she said quickly. Thank you, Granny. But would you mind if I gave it to the baby instead? As you please, Granny said. The polar bear can be from me and the fox from you. How about that? There's hardly any snow left, Tilly said sadly as they went up the hill to the hospital. I wish it would snow again. Lots more. Granny laughed. Me too, but only when we're safely back at home. All of us. Mom, Dad, baby, you, and me. You go first, Granny said when they reached the maternity ward. The nurse at the desk smiled at Tilly. Who are you visiting? My mom. Kirsty Harper, Granny said. Fifth door on the right. Tilly ran ahead, counting the doors, then stopped. She stood on tiptoe so she could look through the glass window in the door. It was like looking into a picture in a frame. Mom was in the bed, but sitting up, talking to Dad, who was in the chair by the bed, one hand on the tiny mound of blanket inside the plastic crib. No wires, no horrible machine or feeding tubes, Tilly let out her breath with a big sigh. Slowly, she opened the door. "Tilly!" Dad sprang up and gave Tilly a huge hug. He held her so close his stubby chin tickled her face. Mom's eyes looked big, shiny with tears about to spill, but she looked fine too, not so pale, and now she was smiling and asking questions, and Tilly felt the huge knot of worry inside her begin to unravel. "Here he is," Dad said, lifting the bundle out of the crib. "Get comfy next to Mom, and you can give him his first ever cuddle from his big sister." The baby was as small as a doll, but the blanket wrapped around him made him feel more sturdy, and it wasn't so scary after all, holding him by herself. His eyes stayed tight shut, his tiny hand poked out the top of the white blanket, staying curled in the fist. The blanket went up and down in time with his breathing. "What should we call him?" Tilly said. "We need to make a list," Dad said. "Any ideas, Till?" She shook her head. Names were hard. They had to sound right and not remind you of anyone else, and they were important too, Tilly thought. They seemed to make you be the person you were. If she'd been something like Harriet or Alex, say instead of Tilly, she'd been different. The baby began to stir. He made tiny noises. His mouth opened a little bit, then he yawned. Tilly passed him across to Mom very, very carefully. Even though he was tiny, her arms ached. "What do you think?" Mom said. "Will he do?" Tilly didn't know what to say. She took the polar bear and the little fox out of the bag, perched them at the foot of the crib so the baby could see them when he opened his eyes. "These are from Granny," she said to Mom. "And you," Granny said. Mom kissed her head. "Thank you, Tilly. How lovely." Granny wanted a turn holding the baby. She said he was beautiful, even though anyone could see he wasn't really. Too scrawny and wrinkled with skin so pale it was nearly transparent, and you could see blue veins underneath. Granny got an old envelope out of her bag. She'd scribbled her own list of names on the back. She handed it to Dad. Dad gave Mom a funny look. "Maximilian, Benjamin, Samuel, James, Raphael, Sebastian," he read out. Mom pulled a face. Tilly laughed. She leaned closer into Mom's warm body. Mom was all soft, wrapped in her fuchsia pink dressing gown. "When are you coming home?" she asked. "A week or so, maybe," Mom said. "They have to do some tests on me and on him, and then we can come home if all's well." "And I'll be back this evening," Dad said. "We can have a special dinner to celebrate. How about that, Tilly?" "What should we have?" "Pancakes, of course," Tilly said.